In Yu-Gi-Oh, they regularly make new cards that are straight up upgraded versions of previous cards in the game, in order to try to make them better, or in some cases, in order to make nerfed versions of previously strong cards. In this list, we'll go over 10 cards which have had retrains of them, starting with some of the nerfed retrains and then going into some of the stronger ones. And at number 10, we have Tribe Infecting Virus. This was a banned card for years until very recently, because it has an effect where you can discard one card from your hand in order to destroy all face-up monsters in the field of a shared type that you declare. So if your opponent is playing a whole bunch of dragons, for example, you can discard a card and just declare dragons to get rid of all of them. And since Tribe Infecting Virus itself is Aqua type, which is an incredibly unpopular type of monster, it is very unlikely that you'll destroy your own cards using its effect, especially since its effect is not once per turn. You can just keep destroying cards as long as you have cards to discard, and this was a little bit too strong in the early days of the game, so it was banned for over 10 years. And they released a retrained version of the card called Tribe Shocking Virus. Now, this is a Thunder Water version, so it was kind of fitting in the same theme of having an unpopular type. Well, it was popular back when it was released, before the Thunder Dragon retrains came out, and it had the effect where once per turn you could banish one monster from your hand to destroy all face-up monsters in the field as the same type as the banished monster. Now, this was nerfed in 3 ways. For one, they actually gave the card a once per turn on its effect. And 2, you have to banish a monster from your hand instead of being able to discard any one card from your hand, which is a much steeper cost. And 3, you only get to destroy cards in the field that share the type as the monster you banished, rather than being able to declare any type of monster. And it's this last restriction that made this card see absolutely no competitive play, and be a heavily nerfed knockoff version of the original card it was very obviously based on. And at number 9, we have Substitoad. This is another card that was banned for having a very overpowered effect, but unlike Tribe Infecting Virus, Substitoad is still banned to this day. And its effect is you contribute one monster to special summon a frog monster from your deck. Here's the thing with this card. This effect is not once per turn. So if you just get out one monster on the field, you can basically put every single frog monster from your deck into the graveyard. And frog cards are good. They still see competitive play even to this day. And they even have cards like Ronin Tonin who can use frogs in the graveyard to bring itself out, who himself does not have a once per turn on its effect. So instead of unbanning Substitoad, they created a retrained nerfed version of the card called Trade Toad, where once per turn you contribute an Aqua type monster to select one frog monster in your graveyard and special summon it. It has the exact same stat line as Substitoad and even looks kinda similar to it. So instead of being able to tribute any monster, you can only tribute Aqua types. You can only special summon frogs from the graveyard instead of from the deck, which is still a good place to special summon them from, but it's nowhere near as overpowered as bringing them out from the deck. And of course they gave the card a once per turn restriction, in addition to not giving it the other frogs can't be destroyed by battle thing. Now with how eager Konami is to errata old effects to make them less overpowered, I could still see them changing Substitoad's effect to being a hard once per turn in order to unban it. But as it is for now, you have this incredibly weak retrain that is basically an unbanned version of Substitoad, which doesn't actually see playing frog decks because it doesn't have frog in its name. So it doesn't really support the archetype anywhere near as much as Substitoad did. And at number 8, we have Magician of Black Chaos, who's had a number of retrain cards that buffed its effect, as it originally did not have one. Now, Magician of Black Chaos was released in the days when special summoning itself was incredibly rare and hard to do. So the very fact that it was a ritual monster with high stats was in itself basically its special effect, as it allowed you to bring out a strong monster without tributes on the field or using your normal summon. Although when players found out how many resources were needed in order to bring out ritual monsters, and how inconsistent that was, these didn't really see any play. So in the future, they started releasing ritual monsters that actually had effects, and they only really saw play if they had overpowered effects, like Demise, King of Armageddon. And it wasn't until Necrons were released that ritual monsters finally had their own meta archetype. But Magician of Black Chaos got a retrain pretty early on in its life, as it was turned into an effect monster called Dark Magician of Chaos, which had the exact same stats as its ritual counterpart, and had the effect where, when it was summoned, you could add a spell card from your graveyard to your hand, and also any monster destroyed by battle was removed from play instead. It was its effect to recover a spell card on its summon that made it so good that it got banned for years. Then the card eventually got an errata to change the effect to only add a spell card during the end phase, which nerfed it enough for them to unban the card. Although that wasn't the only retrain it got. Many years later, it was also given Magician of Black Chaos Max. Basically another ritual monster of it with the exact same stats, but an actual effect. Where, when it's ritual summoned, you contribute a monster in order to lock your opponent out of monster effects for the turn. Which some people have found ways to use this during your opponent's turn in order to create a sort of lockdown. And it also allows you to add a spell card from your graveyard to your hand when it destroys cards by battle. Then there's also Magician of Chaos. This retrain is more of a retrain of Dark Magician though, but I thought I should mention it anyway since it kind of seems softly related to Magician of Black Chaos as well. Now, since Magician of Black Chaos is kind of a part of the Dark Magician archetype, it enjoys a whole bunch of regular support since it's one of the most supported archetypes in the game, so it only makes sense that this off-brand support card got a couple of retrains. And at number 7, we have Red Dragon Archfiend. This is a synchro monster which has an entire archetype based around it, and a whole bunch of evolved synchro versions of the card. However, the original card itself, that the entire archetype is based around, was never super good. It has high stats at 3000, and it has generic materials, so it's not super hard to bring out for a level 8 synchro monster. But its effect is that after it attacks a defense position monster, you can destroy all defense position monsters your opponent controls. And then it has a negative effect where during your end phase, you have to destroy all other monsters you control that did not declare an attack this turn. So it is good against cards and decks that love to go into defense position, but there are not a lot of good decks that do that. So they then created a card, Starlight Red Dragon Archfiend, who has the same attack, level, and synchro materials, and when it's on the field, its name becomes Red Dragon Archfiend. And its effect is much better, where once per turn you can destroy as many special summoned effect monsters in the field as possible with an attack less than this card's, and then inflict 500 damage to your opponent for each destroyed monster. And since most players will have a whole bunch of special summon monsters on their side of the field, and not a lot of cards beat 3000 attack, this card can basically wipe your opponent's entire field of monsters and then just attack directly or whatever. Unlike most other cards that wipe your opponent's field, this card doesn't really have any restrictions after using its effect. You only have to worry about that it can destroy your own monsters as well. And since Starlight Red Dragon Archfiend exists, there's no real reason to play the original Red Dragon Archfiend anymore. So it's been completely replaced by its retrain, which does actually see a healthy amount of competitive play. And at number 6, we have a card that's a little bit of the inverse situation of Red Dragon Archfiend, and that's the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. This is a non-effect fusion monster who requires 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons as its materials, and is just a 4500 attack beatstick. The Blue Eyes White Dragon archetype is probably the most supported archetype in the game. It might be a tie between Dark Magician though, as they both have tons and tons of support cards that constantly get released, so there's lots of retrains of cards in that archetype, including the OG fusion monster from that archetype, as the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon has 2 retrains, Neo Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon and Blue Eyes Alternative Ultimate Dragon. Neo Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon has the same stats and materials for its summon, so it's just a direct retrain of the original, and it has the effect where, after it attacks a monster, you can send a Blue Eyes fusion from your extra deck to the graveyard to allow this card to attack again, which it can use twice. It also has a graveyard effect, where if a Blue Eyes monster you control is targeted for an effect, you can banish this card from the graveyard to negate that activation and destroy the card, which synergizes very well with its first effect, as you can send other copies of this card from your extra deck to the graveyard for it to attack multiple times, which will also then give you protection. And then its other retrain, the Blue Eyes Alternative Ultimate Dragon, also has the same stats and summoning requirements as the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, and its effect is, once per turn, you can destroy 1 card your opponent controls, or up to 3 cards if one of its materials was the Blue Eyes Alternative White Dragon. But it can't attack the turn it activates its effect, and also it cannot be targeted or destroyed by card effects, so some nice baseline passive protection, which is needed on big boss monsters that are hard to bring out. Now, what's funny about these 2 retrains, which are obviously better than the original, is that the original sees more competitive play. And the reason it sees more play is precisely because it does not have an effect. You see, there's this card in the game called Fists of the Unrivaled Tenyi, which has a floating effect that if it's destroyed by an opponent's card effect, you can special summon a non-effect monster from your extra deck. And Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon is the strongest non-effect extra deck monster, which makes it the best target for the floating effect of Fists of the Unrivaled Tenyi. And the card also has another effect on the field, where if you control a non-effect monster, you basically have an Omni Negate, which is super good in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, with how prevalent a Lightning Storm is, decks that want to protect their back row can play Fists of the Unrivaled Tenyi to maybe stop the effect, or if not, get a Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon on the field for free, which will require your opponent to use one of their resources to get rid of it, as it's very hard for the average deck to actually beat over that card. And the two retrained versions of Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon are a little bit too cumbersome to be brought out in an actual competitive deck, so they just don't really see play in an archetype that doesn't really see very much play to begin with. And at number 5, we have Blackluster Soldier. Blackluster Soldier has a grand total of 4 retrains, and an entire archetype created around it. An archetype which doesn't actually use the original card at all, as they just completely replaced it with a new ritual monster instead, which also doesn't really see competitive play either. Blackluster Soldier was created in the same time period as the Magician of Black Chaos, and its special effect was supposed to be the fact that it was special summon monster that has stats that could rival the Blue Eyes White Dragon. And it did actually see play for a hot second when it first came out, in Earth Beatdown decks, before being dropped for being too cumbersome like all the other ritual monsters before Necros came out. But it did get a retrain early on in its life in the form of Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning, which was such a powerful card that it was banned for years, and when it was taken off the ban list, still saw competitive play even up to the modern day. And it has the same stats as the original, only it's a lot easier to special summon, as you just need to banish one light and dark monster from your graveyard. Then, while it's on the field, it has 2 effects you can choose from. One of them is to banish one of your opponent's monsters at the cost of not being able to attack that turn, and its other effect is being able to make a second attack in a row if it destroys a monster by battle. And pretty much the entire Blackluster Soldier archetype was modeled around this card's effect. Envoy of Evening Twilight can also banish a card, Sacred Soldier banishes a card and floats into a high-level warrior, the Ritual inflicts effect damage when it destroys a monster by battle and floats into a Gaia monster on death, and if Ritual summoned using Evening Twilight Night and Beginning Night, it basically gains Envoy of the Beginning's effects as well. Blackluster Soldier also has a link monster called Blackluster Soldier, Soldier of Chaos. It's modeled after Envoy of the Beginning's effect as well, where it can banish a card and attack extra times. Really, the entire archetype was kind of created around the retrain of Blackluster Soldier, and the original one is largely forgotten about. And at number 4, we have Rescue Cat. This is a card which has the effect where it can send itself to the graveyard to special summon 2 level 3 or lower beast type monsters from your deck, with the drawback that they're destroyed during the end phase. Now, being able to special summon 2 monsters from the deck is an incredibly strong effect, especially in a card that does not have a hard once per turn on its effect, nor restrictions on its summon, and had no restrictions on the monsters that it brought out, as long as they fit within the niche of level 3 or lower beast types. And because of this, Rescue Rabbit was looped like crazy in order to bring out a whole bunch of monsters from the deck to go into some FTKs, where it eventually got banned after its Dark Strike Fighter OTK. After the card got banned, they released a retrain called Rescue Rabbit, which was supposed to fix all of the problems that Rescue Cat had, where it cannot be special summoned from the deck, and it banishes itself in order to activate its effect. That way it's much harder to reuse the card's effect over and over, in addition to the fact that they slapped a hard once per turn on it. In fact, they also tried to restrict the monsters it brought out as well, as it could only bring out normal monsters from the deck, and only 2 normal monsters of the exact same name, but they could be level 4 or lower and didn't have to be restricted to beast types. So, a hard once per turn, heavy restrictions on being able to reuse it, only normal monsters, and this same monster twice, so no combos or 1-card synchros, and even in this heavily nerfed version, the card still saw tons of competitive play and had to be limited to 1 copy. Because as it turns out, being able to special summon 2 monsters from the deck is kinda strong. Eventually, they gave Rescue Cat an errata, where the beast type monsters it brought out from the deck had their effects negated, and they gave Rescue Cat itself a hard once per turn on its effect, so you can no longer reuse its effect multiple times in the same turn. And with these erratas, they were able to unban the card. The game had evolved to a point where this wasn't really a huge deal anymore. It still saw play every now and then. The big problem was the fact that it could be reused multiple times in the same turn, which was fixed. And they kind of turned Rescue Cat into an archetype, as they also released Rescue Hamster and Rescue Ferret, as well as a search card called Emerging Emergency Rescue to Rescue. And the funny thing is, Rescue Hamster and Rescue Ferret also saw competitive play. Every single version of Rescue Cat has found their way into some competitive deck, because they all essentially special summon more than 1 monster from the deck in some kind of restrictive way. And special summoning monsters from the deck is one of the best effects in the game, so of course it's going to see play. And at number 3, we have Thousand Eyes Restrict. This was one of the first ever banned fusion monsters, as it had the effect where while it was on the field, other monsters could not change their battle positions or attack. As long as you had this card out, it just locked down your opponent from being able to attack any of your monsters, which was pretty good. It also allowed you to absorb one of your opponent's monsters once per turn, where it would then gain that monster's attack and defense, and if this card was destroyed by battle, you could destroy the equipped monster instead. And because of how bloated early card text was, this card had so much in its card text that it couldn't include that last part of its effect, where it could prevent itself from being destroyed by battle until later printings of the card. And the reason this card got banned was because it didn't have restrictions on how it could be summoned. So if you cheated this card out of the extra deck with something like Instant Fusion, you could just steal one of your opponent's monsters with the Absorb before it went to the graveyard. And during Goat Control format, they would distribute a Goat token with Metamorphosis in order to cheat this card out of the extra deck. And it was a little bit too strong and stayed on the ban list for a long time. But when they did finally release it from the ban list, they released a retrain as kind of a celebration, in the form of Millennium Eyes Restrict. The retrain had the effect where, in response to an opponent's monster effect, you could attach one monster your opponent controls or in their graveyard to this card, in which case it would gain its attack and defense, and negate the effects of the monster that it was equipped to on the field or that were activated. And what this means is if you had this card out, in a chain in response to an opponent's hand trap, for example, you could steal that hand trap from the graveyard and negate that card's effect, basically treating this card as a monster negate. Same if your opponent was using a monster effect during your turn. You could steal that monster and have its effect negated when the chain resolves backwards. And this was a really good card to bring out at the beginning of combo plays with Instant Fusion in order to protect you from hand trap effects, and in fact is still used to this day. But the thing is though, so is Thousand Eyes Restrict. Both the original and the retrain are still heavily played, which I think is the only time that's happened. Usually either the original card is used or the retrain is used, but rarely are both of them used in basically equal amounts, because they're both great Instant Fusion targets, and until that card finally gets banned, they'll probably stay heavily used. And at number 2, we have the Dark Magician Girl. This is another Dark Magician support card, which is a low attack level 6 monster which gains 300 attack for each Dark Magician or Magician of Black Chaos in the graveyard. Unfortunately, it does not gain extra attack for the retrains of Magician of Black Chaos, just the original terrible vanilla one. Which is to say it doesn't really see play, and it did have an entire archetype. Well, kind of a side archetype dedicated around Dark Magician Girls, and even received a direct retrain in the form of Apprentice Illusion Magician, which has the exact same stats as the original and does a much better job of supporting Dark Magician than the original card did, as the retrain has the effect where you can discard a card in order to special summon it from your hand. But if you do choose to normal summon this card, you get to add a Dark Magician from your deck to your hand. It also has a hand trap effect, where if a Dark Spellcaster type monster battles, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to increase that monster's attack and defense by 2000. So, all three of these effects are pretty good, and really fit the theme of supporting Dark Magician a lot better than the original. And it also sees lots of competitive play, but not really for the reason you'd think. You see, the Dark Magician archetype got a support card called Magician's Souls, which can special summon itself from your hand by sending a level 6 or higher spellcaster type monster from your deck to the graveyard. And it has an effect on the field where you can cycle through 2 spell or traps you don't need in order to draw 2 cards. So it's useful in a lot of decks for getting a free monster on the field and for cycling through spell and trap cards. But in order to special summon the card from their hand, they need a level 6 or higher spellcaster type monster in their deck. And if they don't natively play high level spellcasters, like say Spirals used to with Spiral Master Plan, then they would have to include at least one high-level spellcaster in their deck in order to actually use Magician's Souls effect. And the card they opt to use most of the time is Apprentice Illusion Magician, because it can special summon itself from your hand by just discarding any one card. Most meta decks love to have their monsters in the graveyard, and they love to special summon monsters from the hand. So Apprentice Illusion Magician supports both of those playstyles. So if they do accidentally draw into the card and have to use it normally, instead of using it as a garnet in the deck for Magician's Souls, it actually is live in the hand. So really, Apprentice Illusion Magician sees competitive play because of another Dark Magician support card, and not really because the card itself is super good. It's just one of the most versatile high-level spellcaster type monsters you can play in a deck that doesn't really use spellcaster type monsters. but it's played enough to take a high spot on this list nonetheless. And at number 1, we have Ultimate Tyranno. This card was supposed to be like a boss monster for dinosaur types, in the same vein as Superconductor Tyranno, who himself was the highest attack main deck monster that didn't have restrictions on its summoning or attacking, with 3300 attack. In fact, it only had beneficial effects on the field, where you could once per turn just tribute one monster to inflict 1000 damage to your opponent, at the cost of the card not being able to attack that turn. And Ultimate Tyranno could attack all of your opponent's monsters once each, and was used in all kinds of OTK plays in the past with Ojama Trio. So when they released a new wave of dinosaur support, they thought to create a retrain which combined both of these monsters, in the form of Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, where this card has over 3000 attack, 3500 to be exact, really breaking the mold of not going above 3000 attack on main deck monsters, unless it's hard to summon. Basically, only dinosaur monsters do this. There isn't another archetype that goes above 3000 attack unless that's the point of the monster. The card is also really easy to special summon, as you can bring it out from your hand by just banishing 2 dinosaur type monsters from your graveyard, which is actually a much easier summoning condition than its original 2 cards. It has a quick effect Book of Eclipse, where it can destroy dinosaur monster in the field or in your hand in order to flip all of your opponent's monsters face down, which can be used on your opponent's turn to disrupt plays, or to set up its other effect, where this card can attack all of your opponent's monsters once each, just like Ultimate Tyranno. However, if it attacks a defense position monster, it can send that monster to the graveyard without a battle and then inflict 1000 points of damage to your opponent, which is a homage to the 1000 points of burn damage from Superconductor Tyranno. And since it sends that monster to the graveyard by card effects, which doesn't count as destruction, it bypasses all kinds of protection effects, which makes this a really good boss monster that kind of single-handedly allows dinosaur decks to be competitive. Well, to an extent. It's just a really good boss monster, which was basically created by a combination of 2 of the old dinosaur boss monsters. So I guess it technically counts as a combination of past cards, since it doesn't retrain just one of them. And there is a whole list of monsters just like that, which could probably be a video in and of itself. But when it comes to monster retrains, this is probably one of the best retrains in the game, as it's also one of the best boss monsters in the game, which is why I think it should take the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. YuGiOh has a ton of retrains, so there's enough for like an entire different video on this topic. Maybe like 5 other videos. So if you know of any other retrains that should have made this list, or have ideas for videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And did you know only 35.5% of people who watch these videos are subscribed to the channel?